My son was detained for being an immigrant, but what he told the judge changed the course of the court. It was 3:22 a.m. when the alarm went off in the small two-bedroom apartment in South Phoenix. The sound was faint, but enough to wake Juanito, who had slept with one eye open for as long as he could remember. Not because he was an insomniac, but because he'd learned that if you sleep too soundly in a land that isn't yours, you risk losing what little you have. He got up quietly and walked barefoot on the cold floor. He passed through the living room, where leftovers of the previous night's rice and beans still sat, and went into the cramped bathroom. Splashing cold water on his face, he looked into the mirror. He was 20 years old, but the reflection showed someone older. He had a defined jawline, thick eyebrows, and a small scar near his left eye that he didn't recall having before crossing the border. His mother was still asleep in the back room. They didn't have much, but she always said that as long as they had a roof and a job, they were better off than back there. "At least here, they don't shoot you in the back, mijo," she would say. Juanito never argued. He wasn't sure if he still believed it. He had a quick breakfast, stale bread and cold coffee. He grabbed his backpack with gloves, a spare shirt, a bottle of water, and his lunch, 2 burritos wrapped in aluminum foil. In a hidden inner pocket, carefully sealed in a plastic sleeve, was his biggest secret: fake documents, an Arizona ID, and a social security number his mother had bought for $500. "It's not legal, Juanito, but it's all we've got. And if you don't take the risk, you don't eat," she had told him one winter night in a hushed voice. If you're enjoying compelling stories like this one, make sure to like, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. He left exactly at 4. The street was still asleep, cloaked in that pre-dawn darkness when the world seems to pause. The air was dry, the sky absolutely clear. He climbed into his old '98 Honda Civic, which had more duct tape than original paint. Turning the key, the engine gave a tired roar. A scapula of Our Lady of Guadalupe dangled from the rearview mirror. Juanito touched it with his fingertips before driving off. The trip to work was barely 20 minutes, but he always left an hour early. Not out of caution, just habit. He liked stopping by a gas station on the way to buy coffee and listen to the radio news. It made him feel part of the country, even though he knew that for many he was not welcome. That morning, however, something felt off. Ever since he'd turned onto Chandler Heights, he'd noticed a white SUV behind him. It had no visible plates. Its windows were tinted. At first, he thought he was just being paranoid. When you live undocumented, fear is always your shadow. But then the SUV lit up with blue lights, and he knew he wasn't imagining things. Juanito pulled over slowly, parking by an empty lot. He switched the engine off, taking a deep breath. Deep down, he knew this day could come at any time. He knew that, at any moment, it could all end. But you can never really prepare for when it actually happens. "Good morning. License and vehicle registration," one of the agents said, shining a flashlight directly in his eyes. Juanito handed over the papers without saying a word. He'd rehearsed this scenario many times in his head. Don't argue, don't tremble, don't make sudden moves. It wouldn't do any good. The agent studied the license intently, then exchanged a look with his partner. They said nothing and walked away to talk on the radio. Meanwhile, Juanito's hands were sweating inside his jacket pockets. He wanted to check his phone, warn his mother, but knew it would be pointless. She was likely asleep at that hour, and any sudden move could be seen as a threat. They came back and asked him to step out. Juanito obeyed. They handcuffed him with professional precision. They didn't insult him, didn't yell, and didn't even meet his eyes. To them, Juanito was just another number in an overburdened system, another case, another faceless file. He climbed into the back of the SUV, and the doors slammed shut with a metallic clang. The vehicle sped away, leaving behind his car, his backpack, his coffee, his burritos, and his scapula. Everything remained there under a flickering streetlight, as if time had frozen. During the ride, no one spoke. No one explained anything. He heard only the driver's murmured radio and the tires screech on the road. Hours later, Juanito was admitted to a detention center in Florence. A cold, concrete place with long corridors and electronically locked doors. There, they took his photo, fingerprinted him, assigned him a number. They removed his shoelaces, his belt, and gave him a dark blue uniform that smelled of cheap disinfectant. That night, lying on a metal bunk with no pillow, surrounded by strangers and never-dimming lights, Juanito did not cry or speak. He just stared at the ceiling, motionless, as if waiting for someone to burst in and say it had all been a mistake. Outside, the world kept turning. His mother didn't know. Nobody did. It was as if he'd disappeared, and in a way, yes, he had. Doña Marisol woke at 6, as she did every day. The first thing she did was check her phone on the nightstand. No calls, no messages from her son. That was strange. Juanito always texted her when he got off work, even just a "I'm home" or an emoji, but that morning, the phone was silent. She figured maybe his battery had died. She tried not to worry. While the news on TV spoke of a heat wave coming to the state, she made coffee in her tiny kitchen. Then she cut open a roll, smeared it with beans and cheese, leaving it on the table. It was what Juanito usually ate when he came home from the construction site, though most days he was too exhausted to even be hungry. Hours went by. At 9, Marisol called his cell. It rang, but no answer. She tried again. Nothing. By noon, she called Juanito's boss, whom she'd met only once when they went to pick up his paycheck. The man was blunt. "He didn't show up for work today, ma'am. Nor yesterday. We thought he was sick." That "nor yesterday" chilled her blood. "What do you mean? Nor yesterday?" she asked, voice trembling. "Yeah, he didn't show up. We thought something happened. Haven't heard from him." The boss replied curtly, sounding unconcerned. Marisol's legs felt weak. She sat on the couch, holding the phone against her chest. Something was wrong. Juanito never missed work, ever. She tried not to panic, thinking maybe he was staying at a friend's place, or maybe his car broke down. Any explanation was better than the one creeping into her mind, the one she was too afraid to admit. She spent the afternoon making calls. No one had seen him. She asked at hospitals. She walked to 2 police stations, pretending she was looking for her cousin, because her fear kept her from speaking freely. Everywhere, they treated her with indifference. "We don't have anyone under that name," they'd say. Of course, Juanito wasn't using his real name on his papers. That night, she didn't sleep. She paced around the tiny apartment, praying under her breath, clutching a photo of her son. She remembered with a lump in her throat the promise she'd made to him in Guatemala the night they fled. It was nearly 13 years ago. Marisol still recalled vividly the night her husband, Sergio, was killed outside their home for refusing to let the gangs recruit 7-year-old Juanito. Sergio said no. They shot him 3 times, the last bullet to the head. That same night, Marisol wrapped Juanito in a blanket and ran. She didn't think about plans or money or documents. She just knew they had to get out. They crossed on foot with coyotes, risking their lives in the desert. They almost died of thirst. Juanito watched her quietly with those big, frightened eyes, never crying, maybe because he already sensed that tears had no place in this new life. Marisol had lived with fear ever since, learning to hide it, but still feeling her heart tighten each time someone knocked on the door. She earned her living cleaning houses for people who rarely looked her in the eye, hauling cleaning supplies in a backpack like they were weapons for a war. Every cent she saved was for her son. Juanito was everything, her purpose, her life. Now, she'd gone almost 48 hours with no news from him. On the 3rd day, at dawn, the house phone rang. An unknown number. Marisol snatched it up, heart pounding. "Hello? Are you the mother of Juanito Ramirez?" The voice was dry, emotionless, male. "Yes, yes, I am. Who is this?" "This is the Florence Detention Center. Your son was detained by immigration agents 2 days ago. We're sorry. He's in federal custody." For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Marisol felt like she was suffocating. She couldn't move or speak. She heard only her ragged breathing and the hum of the refrigerator in the background. "But is he all right? Is he alive?" she managed to ask in a trembling voice. "He's in stable condition. We only just requested family contact today. You can arrange a visit with a lawyer. We can't give more information." The line went dead. Marisol fell to her knees in the middle of the living room, phone in hand. The tears she had held inside for so long poured out all at once. She screamed, she cursed, she prayed. She clung to the air as if she could protect her son from miles away. She didn't know how or when or what would happen next. She only knew that her son was in government hands, and in this country, that often meant there was no turning back. Juanito had been swallowed by the system. Worse yet, he'd kept quiet all this time so she wouldn't worry, as if his own pain weren't enough. The Florence Detention Center was a time capsule. Inside, the hours didn't follow the rhythms of the outside world. Every day was the same, as though clocks had stopped and the sun refused to shine through the tiny slits in the walls. Juanito had been detained 5 days when they told him he had a hearing scheduled at the Eloy Immigration Court, a federal building less than an hour away. They gave him a paper with a date, a time, and a courtroom number. Nothing else. No explanation of what he could say. No lawyer assigned. No interpreter offered. Nothing. "If you have someone to represent you, bring them," said a tired-voiced officer, sliding the documents under the metal door. Juanito took them silently and lay down on the metal bunk, staring at the ceiling. Fear was no longer a feeling. It was his state of being. He felt it in his bones, in his stomach, in his unsteady heartbeat. What hurt most was not the threat of deportation, but picturing his mother's face when she learned the full story. He knew she was already suffering, probably crying, probably not sleeping since his arrest, but he hadn't told her everything yet. Maybe he never would. If he told her the whole truth, that his documents were fake, that he could face charges for fraud, that there was no guarantee of asylum or any pardon, she'd break down, and Juanito needed her to stay strong. Meanwhile, Marisol was doing the impossible to find help. With what little money she had, she hired a local attorney, Lorena Camargo, who specialized in immigration. Lorena wasn't famous and didn't have a fancy office. She worked from a rented room in a Mesa community center, surrounded by old files and posters in English and Spanish saying, "Know your rights." Lorena listened to Marisol's story, noted every detail she could recall, and checked the hearing date. "It's soon. We have only a few days to prepare," she said honestly but calmly. "And with fake documents, the judge might order immediate deportation unless we present something stronger, something human, something that shows he's more than just a number." Marisol nodded, pulling a small cardboard box from her purse. Inside were photos: Juanito as a little boy playing ball in a park, Juanito helping someone move boxes, Juanito in dusty work clothes. There were also thank you notes from elderly people he'd cared for after his construction shifts. Lorena took these items carefully. "This can help, but it'll be hard, really hard. If the judge has his mind set, there's not much we can do." "So, they'll send him back?" Marisol asked, trembling. Lorena didn't respond immediately, just lowered her gaze. The court date arrived, a hot and arid morning. The sun was blazing as Juanito arrived in shackles at the courthouse, driven in a caged van along with 5 other detainees. All wore the same resigned expression. Inside, the courtroom felt cold, almost clinical. A portrait of the president hung on the wall beside the American flag. The judge, a 60-ish white man, wore a dark robe and flipped through cases quickly, as if each one were just a cog on an assembly line. Juanito was the fourth to be brought in. They sat him down in front of a microphone. To the left stood the government's representative, a stern-faced ICE prosecutor with a stack of documents. Lorena, the attorney, was already there and acknowledged Juanito with a small nod. Neither wanted to draw more attention than necessary. The judge began reading the file in a brisk, precise tone. The respondent was apprehended driving a vehicle without a valid license, possessing false documents, and lacking lawful immigration status. Immediate deportation is recommended for identity fraud and illegal presence. Any objections? Lorena stood. Your Honor, we request consideration of humanitarian relief. My client arrived here as a minor fleeing extreme violence in his home country. He's worked tirelessly to support his mother and contributed to his community. We ask that he be granted a temporary stay while we file an asylum claim based on humanitarian grounds. The judge finally lifted his eyes from the file and looked at Juanito for a few moments, then back at the file. There's no asylum application here, nor evidence of imminent danger if he returns. None of that is in this file. Do you have documentation? We're in the process of gathering it, Your Honor. All we ask for is time. The ICE prosecutor spoke up. Your Honor, the young man used false paperwork, regardless of his personal story. That's a federal offense. There's no basis to delay. The government recommends proceeding with the deportation order. The judge nodded, snapped the file shut, and picked up his pen to sign. That's when Juanito, silent until now, raised his hand. Your Honor, can I say something? Lorena turned to him, surprised. The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have something to declare? Juanito nodded, took a deep breath. Yes, sir. I just need you to hear me. A tense hush filled the courtroom. The kind of silence not heard every day in such a place. The judge lowered his pen slowly. The prosecutor squinted. From the back row, Marisol clutched her chest. Then, Juanito began to speak. But that is another story. The courtroom fell silent, thick and tense, as though everyone had stopped breathing for a second. The judge, still holding his pen, leaned back a bit. He looked at Juanito intently, no rush in his gaze. You have the floor, mister. Ramirez, he said neutrally, with mild curiosity. Juanito cleared his throat. His voice did not tremble. On the contrary, it was steady. This was not the voice of a broken young man, but of someone who had borne a heavy burden for too long. Your Honor, I don't have an expensive lawyer. I don't have much education, and my English isn't perfect. I don't have papers. And yes, I used fake documents. I won't lie to you, but I never used them to steal. I never used them to hurt anyone. I used them to work, to clean bathrooms, haul heavy loads, and take care of elderly folks their own families didn't want to care for anymore. Lorena, his attorney, stared in amazement. They had never rehearsed this. Marisol, sitting at the back, gripped her rosary hard, tears streaming without her knowing. Juanito breathed and went on. I came here with my mom when I was a kid. I was 8. I remember that night, no moon in the sky. We walked through the desert without water. Terrified, I didn't know why we were running, just that we had to. We were running from the same people who killed my father in front of our house because he wouldn't hand me over to the gangs. I was the child they wanted. The prosecutor set her pen down. The judge stopped glancing at the papers. Everyone focused on Juanito, who now spoke steadily, as though his soul were pouring out. My mom saved me. She carried me on her shoulders when I couldn't walk anymore. She slept on the floor, hidden, so I could get some rest. We got here with nothing. We stayed in houses where we weren't wanted, ate whatever we could. My mom worked from 5 a.m. East to midnight just to give me a chance. His voice caught, but he didn't stop or lower his gaze. I grew up knowing I was illegal, that I wasn't supposed to exist, that I was a mistake. Still, I worked hard, studied as much as I could, started working at 15. I've never gotten in trouble, never stolen, never smoked, never done anything but work to support her. He turned slightly toward the judge. I know, to you, I'm just another statistic, another kid who crossed without permission, who lied to get a job. But I'm asking you, please, Your Honor, don't see me as a criminal. See me as a son who just wants to give back a fraction of what his mother sacrificed for him. For a brief moment, there was an even deeper silence, as if the very walls of the courtroom were listening. Marisol could not stop her tears, clutching her purse to her chest as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The prosecutor, who had remained impassive until now, spoke in a different tone, quiet, not cold, almost human. Your Honor, she said calmly, while the respondent did commit an immigration offense, there are elements in this case that warrant humanitarian review. I request a temporary suspension of proceedings so he can formally file for asylum. The judge narrowed his eyes, studying the prosecutor, then Lorena, then Juanito again. This is unusual in my courtroom, he finally said. But sometimes justice also means listening, not just judging. He put the pen in his robe pocket and closed the file. Then, in a clear, loud voice, the hearing is temporarily suspended. Mr. Ramirez will be released under supervision with electronic monitoring. He has 90 days to present formal evidence for humanitarian asylum. We'll meet again. The gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack. Session over. Juanito did not smile or raise his arms. He just inhaled. For the first time in days, he breathed without feeling pain in his chest. He was led out of the courtroom, fitted with an ankle monitor, given a date to check in at the immigration office, and warned if he violated the conditions, deportation would be immediate. Hours later, in the courthouse parking lot, Marisol hugged him for the first time in over a week. There were no words, only tears. It wasn't exactly freedom, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all you need to keep going. That same afternoon, after leaving the courthouse, the prosecutor on the case, a woman named Karen Doval, locked herself in her office for over an hour. She shut the file with Juanito Ramirez's name, took off her glasses, and stared out at the empty courtyard through her window. She'd spent 12 years at Homeland Security, handling hundreds, maybe thousands of similar cases. Young people arrested, mothers separated, forged documents, stories that felt cookie-cutter. She'd always kept an emotional distance, because if you let yourself get attached, you couldn't do the job. But that day, something was different. Juanito's words wouldn't leave her mind, not so much because of what he said, though it was powerful, but how he said it. With no rage, no begging, just dignity, like someone pushed to the margins, refusing to live on his knees. She remembered her own story. Her father was a Cuban immigrant who spent years washing dishes in New York. Her mother, from Mexico, cleaned schools at night. Karen grew up between two languages, two worlds, constantly checking expiration dates on documents. That night, she wrote a report on her own, without asking anyone. She recommended that the court review Juanito's case under extraordinary humanitarian circumstances. It didn't guarantee anything, but it opened a door, a small reprieve in a place where doors were usually slammed shut. Meanwhile, in the modest apartment in South Phoenix, Marisol and Juanito tried to regain some sense of normalcy, though nothing was normal. He now lived with an electronic ankle bracelet. He couldn't leave certain areas without permission, had to check in twice a week and sign paperwork, and any slip-up could mean immediate deportation. Still, partial freedom felt like a miracle. Marisol threw herself into cooking. She poured all her love into every tortilla, every chicken soup. Juanito ate in silence, gaze still wandering back to those days in detention. At night, he hardly slept. He'd wake in a panic, sweaty, feeling like someone was calling him by a number instead of his name. A week after his court date, leaving his ICE check-in, a woman approached him in the hallway. She was around 30, carrying a camera and a notebook, and spoke with a Central American accent. "Are you Juanito Ramirez?" He stopped and nodded, uncertain. "I'm Mariana Solorzano. I volunteer for a blog that features immigrant stories. Someone told me about what you said in court." It was powerful. People out there need to hear things like that. Juanito didn't reply. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, let alone journalists, even if they were grassroots. Mariana handed him a business card. "I'm not asking for an interview, only that if one day you want to share your story, call me. There are others like you who feel alone, and what you said, it changed something. You may not see it yet, but it did." That night, Juanito left her card on the table and said nothing, but his mother spoke. "What did that woman want?" "Nothing. She wanted my story." Marisol said nothing at first, then sat across from him, speaking in a way she hadn't since he was small. "Do you know why we left Guatemala, mijo? Do you really know?" "Because they killed Papa," he whispered. "Not just that. We left because I didn't want your life to end before it even started. Because back there you wouldn't have made it to 15. Now you're here with a second chance. Don't hold back anymore. Speak. Let them hear you." Juanito blinked at her, surprised by her resolve. "Mama, I'm nobody. You're everything to me, and maybe you will be to people you haven't even met yet." 2 days later, Juanito called Mariana. They met at a small cafe in Tempe. He spoke quietly, matter-of-factly, with no drama, told her everything from the night they fled through the desert to the morning he was cuffed on the street. Mariana took notes, recorded audio, and listened respectfully. A few days later, she posted his story on her blog under the headline, "I'm not a criminal, just a son who wants to honor his mother." The piece went viral within hours. Hundreds of comments poured in, some hatefullies, of course, because hatred always finds a voice. But most were supportive, coming from mothers, young people, workers who saw themselves in Juanito's story. Human rights organizations began reaching out. One that offered legal aid to low-income immigrants volunteered to help with his asylum claim. Even a Latino congressman from Arizona, David Herrera, shared the article online, writing, "This isn't about immigration, it's about humanity." Juanito was stunned. He had no idea how his words, uttered in desperation, could resonate with so many. But they did, and that was only the beginning. Judge Arthur Callahan had read hundreds of immigration files in his career, tough cases, tragic cases, forgettable ones. Over time, he learned to read without getting involved, to listen without reacting, to judge without feeling, because letting even one story, one emotion, slip through would break the balance he needed to uphold the law. But that day, in courtroom 5 of the Eloy Immigration Court, something cracked. Juanito's words still echoed in his head. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a son who wants to give back to the mother who sacrificed everything." Something about that voice, about that calm determination, had unsettled him. It wasn't common for someone so young to speak so clearly, or to do so in the midst of a near-certain deportation hearing. Later, in his office, Callahan looked at the open file on his desk, a letter from prosecutor Karen Doval recommending, surprisingly, that the case be considered for humanitarian reasons. It included letters of support, sworn statements, clippings from community newspapers, and a copy of the blog post by Mariana Solorzano titled, "He Didn't Beg for Mercy, He Asked for Justice." Callahan removed his glasses, walked slowly to the window, and watched the setting sun over downtown Phoenix. He wasn't a man of faith, but he felt like a heavy decision rested in his hands, heavier than most. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. He returned to his desk, took a blank sheet of paper, and wrote carefully, "This court suspends any deportation proceedings against Mr. Juanito Ramirez while his status is reviewed under a humanitarian exemption." He is approved for supervised release, and a 90-day period is granted to file a humanitarian asylum application with sufficient documentation. He signed it, breathed deeply, and for the first time in years felt that he was following not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Marisol learned the news from attorney Lorena Camargo's phone call one afternoon. She was doing laundry in the shared building facility when her phone vibrated in her pocket. "Marisol," Lorena said, getting right to it. "We got the judge's decision. The deportation is suspended. Juanito will be released under supervision while we prepare the asylum case." Marisol dropped the wet towel on the floor. Her voice cracked instantly. "Really? My son won't be deported?" "For now, no. There's still a lot to do, but this is a real chance. They've given us time, and in immigration, time is pure gold." Marisol said nothing, just sank onto a bench, covering her face with her hands. She cried silently, surrounded by the whir of washing machines, as life around her kept going as if nothing had changed, even though, for a moment, her world had stopped to give her a small glimmer of hope. Juanito was released the next morning. They fitted him with an electronic ankle monitor and handed him strict rules: not to leave the county without permission, to sign in twice a week at the ICE office, and that his case was still under review. Not full freedom, but better than being locked up. As he walked out, his mother waited, eyes brimming, arms wide. They embraced for long minutes, wordless. That hug said it all, a reunion of two souls who'd feared they might never see each other again. On the drive home, they barely spoke. Juanito stared out the window, seeing Phoenix as if for the first time. People rushing, food stalls on corners, desert trees with scorched bark. Everything looked different now that he understood how precarious it all was. That night, they ate together for the first time since his arrest. Marisol cooked his favorite beans, fresh tortillas, and rice with eggs. No grand feast, but a celebratory meal to him. Afterward, they sat in the small living room, he looking off into space, she holding a cup of tea. "Mama," he said suddenly, "if they grant me asylum, I want to study. I want to do something more. Maybe help others like me." Marisol gazed at him with all the warmth of a mother's heart. "You already are, mijo. Just by speaking, you've helped. You've given courage to those too afraid to speak." Juanito lowered his head, struggling to believe. 2 days later, Mariana Solorzano contacted him again, this time not alone. She arrived with Omar Salas, an attorney from Latinos Unidos por la Justicia, a group that aids immigrants who can't afford legal help. "Juanito," Mariana said, "your story touched a lot of people. Omar wants to help you with the asylum process, full legal representation. No charge." Juanito froze. He didn't understand why so many people were now stepping forward to help, what they saw in him that he didn't see in himself. "For free," he whispered. "Yes. What you said reminded us why we do this. You're not a mere number, you're an example. And that bothers folks who want things to stay as they are," said Omar. Juanito accepted. For the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. That same week, in a grey, windowless office at Homeland Security, a supervisor was reviewing the Ramirez case. Frowning. He didn't like precedents that broke the mold, especially not cases gaining public attention. He made notes, sent emails, and requested an internal evaluation. Not for justice. Sometimes when someone begins to inspire others, the system grows uneasy. Juanito, without knowing it, was no longer just a kid with fake papers. He was a threat to their complacency. It was stunning how such a small thing, a few minutes of testimony, a story on a community blog, could grow so quickly. Within days, Juanito's name was circulating not just among immigrant rights defenders, but also among journalists, politicians, and everyday people who saw in him a different face than what the news typically showed about immigrants. Mariana's article was soon translated into English and shared on several national platforms. Univision, Telemundo, and even Latino segments of CNN asked Mariana for more about the Guatemalan young man who halted a deportation with nothing but his own words. Cautious, Mariana guarded Juanito and Marisol's privacy, denying direct interviews but documenting every step, every reaction, every letter of support or email that arrived. Some were just words of encouragement, others told similar stories. Teenagers who'd crossed on foot, women cleaning offices at night, parents waiting for a promised immigration reform that never came. Slowly, the Latino community began viewing Juanito not as a victim, but as a symbol of something they'd long sought: dignity. In Phoenix, local response was immediate. Latinos Unidos por la Justicia launched a social media campaign under the hashtag Justicia para Juanito, initially aiming only to share his story. But it rapidly turned into a fundraising effort for legal costs, translation services, psychological evaluations, everything needed to build a strong asylum case. They set a $5,000 goal. In under 72 hours, they raised more than $30,000. Attorney Lorena Camargo could hardly believe it. Accustomed to fighting invisible cases with volunteers and favors, she now found herself coordinating national organizations, fielding media requests, and organizing other lawyers eager to join the defense. Marisol, watching all this unfold, remained silent. She didn't fully grasp how her son, just another face in the crowd until recently, had become news. Yet deep in her mother's intuition, she sensed this wouldn't come free. Public attention could also bring danger. One afternoon, folding laundry at home, she asked Juanito, "Are you sure you want to keep going with this?" He looked up from the couch, where he was answering messages on his phone. With what? With speaking out, showing your name, appearing everywhere. "I don't want you getting more exposed than you need to." Juanito studied her, then came over and sat down. "Mama, I was exposed the moment they cuffed me for going to work. I was stripped bare the day they locked me up, not knowing if I'd ever get out. Now that people are listening, I won't stay quiet." Marisol nodded, but the fear lingered. The special kind of fear only a migrant mother knows. Seeing her son stand tall, while knowing that the system doesn't always respond with fairness. Soon, the system itself responded. In a federal office in Tucson, an ICE supervisor reviewed Juanito's file with growing irritation. The case was marked media sensitive, meaning every step demanded thorough documentation and updates to higher-ups. This was no ordinary file. It was high risk, and for some inside the system, that spelled trouble. "Why are we letting a kid with fake papers become a hero?" one supervisor asked in a closed meeting. "Because we have a prosecutor who opened the door and a judge who went soft," another replied in a dry tone. The case was escalated to Washington for review. Technically, there was no violation. Everything had followed procedure, but that didn't mean it couldn't be reversed. They approved an intensive subject monitoring, watching Juanito. They did not use his name. They called him the subject, as if he had no face, no story, no mother. Meanwhile, Juanito carried on under surveillance. He reported weekly to the ICE office, met with Omar and Lorena, and kept volunteering at the organization that had helped him. He was given small tasks: sorting donated clothes, helping translators, distributing lunches, and he tackled them all with a quiet focus, as if he owed a personal debt he intended to repay. Sometimes, leaving the ICE office, he noticed suspicious looks. Agents eyeing him a bit too long, a black car tailing him at a distance. He said nothing so as not to worry his mother, but he was no longer naive. He knew not everyone was on his side. Some within the system saw his visibility as a threat. Still, he knew he couldn't stop now, not after everything he'd said and the spark it had ignited. His story, once nearly silenced, was becoming a voice, and that voice, day by day, was getting harder to ignore. The morning arrived with a rare coolness in Phoenix's summer heat. The oppressive temperatures had granted a brief reprieve. Maybe the sky wanted to breathe too. On the corner of Van Buren Street, across from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement building, about 30 people had gathered. Some held signs, others just stood quietly, many with stories of their own. Justicia para Juanito, read one big sign. Another sign, smaller, held by an elderly woman, said, "You don't lock up the future, you support it." This wasn't some massive march with chants and flags. It was more like a vigil, quiet yet powerful, organized by the local Latino community in response to the story everyone in the state had heard, people who had never met Juanito but felt represented by him, who had also crossed deserts, dodged raids, and raised kids in fear of the doorbell. Marisol arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries. She walked nervously but kept her face calm. She knew being there meant even more exposure, but staying silent was no longer an option. When Juanito exited his weekly ICE check-in and saw these people waiting for him, he stopped cold. It took several seconds to process. At first, he thought it was just some random protest. But then he recognized the faces. Mariana was there, so was Omar, and even his old ESL teacher, Mrs. Cruz, who held a photo of him at age 14. Juanito didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to this, to being seen, to being supported. He walked toward them, and they started clapping. No chanting or shouting, just a steady applause that seemed to say, "We stand with you." That same day, videos of the moment popped up on social media. They made their way to reporters, activists, and inevitably the ICE desks in Tucson and an office in Washington. There, a man in a dark blue tie and a stony expression typed an email to the regional director. "Subject Ramirez has sparked unauthorized public gatherings. We recommend an urgent review of supervision status and an institutional vulnerability analysis if asylum is granted." In other words, they disliked the support he was getting, disliked that an undocumented immigrant was becoming a symbol, disliked the system being questioned by someone who, legally speaking, shouldn't even be there. The next day, attorney Lorena Camargo received an unexpected notice. Immigration wanted to thoroughly reassess Juanito's file, including his entire history from when he first entered. Not only the asylum case, but also an audit of the documents he'd used, past employers, even his school records. "This is a dirty move," Lorena said, slamming the file shut. "What does it mean?" Juanito asked from across her desk. "It means they're looking for something, anything to justify kicking you out. They want to find a loophole to say you don't deserve to stay." Juanito lowered his head, feeling small again, like during that first interrogation. "And if they find something, I don't know, but we won't let them use it against you without a fight," Lorena said firmly. That same day, Latinos Unidos por la Justicia held a press conference, not just about Juanito, but to denounce the disproportionate surveillance and institutional pressure on migrants who dare speak out. It wasn't just about him, it was a pattern. At home, Marisol held on to her faith. She lit a candle each night before an image of St. Oscar Romero, not praying for miracles, but for strength. Now that her son's case was no longer purely legal but also political, she knew the coming steps would be tougher. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" she asked him again. "Yes. There's no turning back now." "Then be ready. They don't like it when someone like you finds a voice." Juanito nodded. He wasn't afraid of speaking out, but he understood something he hadn't before. The real problem wasn't that he spoke. The real problem was that people were listening. It was 5:12 a.m. when Marisol woke with a jolt, not to the alarm, an unease in her chest. She got up, walked to the kitchen without making noise, and put water on to boil for coffee. She'd been sleeping badly for weeks. That morning, the air felt heavier than usual, as if something was about to shift. At 7:15, Juanito's phone vibrated on the table. An email from the immigration court, subject line in bold, Final decision in the case of Ramirez, Juanito. His heart thudded. He looked at his mother, who still held her mug. She said nothing, just nodded. Juanito opened the message, reading it word for word, not blinking. When he finished, he read it again. Then he put the phone down, silent. "What does it say?" Marisol asked gently, as if scared to break something fragile. They gave me permission to stay," he whispered. "They cancelled the deportation order. The judge found exceptional humanitarian merit. I'm allowed to stay legally, and I can apply for residency in the future." Marisol brought both hands to her mouth, speechless, tears beginning to flow. She cried the way she hadn't since crossing the border, with all those years of fear, those nights in hiding, those dawn shifts. She cried for every unanswered prayer, for each second she'd spent worrying he'd be taken away. Juanito hugged her, tight. For the first time in ages, not holding back. "Mama, they're not going to tear us apart." That same day, the news spread. Mariana Solorzano was first to publish it, respectfully rather than sensationally. Her piece's title, "The Judge Listened, Juanito Gets to Stay." Local outlets picked it up, then national media. Even political commentary shows started debating it, some hailing Juanito's case as an example of struggle and humanity, others criticizing it as a reward for someone who'd entered irregularly. Beyond the chatter, the truth was that the name Juanito Ramirez was now part of the national immigration conversation. Latinos Unidos por la Justicia organized a community event to celebrate the ruling. Nothing fancy, just a symbolic gathering at a local cultural center with a small platform and plastic chairs. Families, workers, volunteers, and even NGO reps from California, Texas, and New Mexico came. Juanito stepped up to the mic, hands shaking. He'd never spoken to a crowd before. Clearing his throat, all he managed was, "Thank you for listening. I'm not special. I just spoke up because I couldn't keep silent. If you heard me, you can hear others too. There are thousands out there, invisible, waiting for someone to see them." Applause followed, quiet, not thundering, but heartfelt. But not everything was celebration. That same week, his attorney Omar Salas received a notice that made him frown. "A new background check from Homeland Security," he later explained to Lorena. "They want to review his entire past. Even after the ruling, they still want to probe his old employers, how he got his documents, if he ever lied on any forms. Technically, they can open a new investigation if they find some undisclosed detail." Lorena leaned on her desk. "They won't give up. They can't stand that he won." "Exactly." Marisol heard the news with narrowed eyes. No tears, no surprise, just a calm acceptance. "I knew it wouldn't be that easy. It never is for us." Juanito stayed calm, no longer the frightened boy from the Florence cell. He'd endured too much, seen what his words could do, and how a single voice could spark a movement. "Let them dig," he said firmly. "I've got nothing to hide. If they want to shut me up again, they'll have to hear me again." That night, Marisol made beef soup and cilantro rice, warming tortillas by hand. She didn't say it, but it was her way of celebrating. They turned the radio on, just music, no news. A vintage tune played softly as she collected the dishes and Juanito washed cups in hot water. For a few minutes, there was peace, something that had been denied them for so long. But as music filled their kitchen, an ICE agent in some distant office typed up a discreet request to reopen Subject Ramirez's background check without immediate cause or direct notification. Because when the system loses, it doesn't always accept defeat. Sometimes the enemy isn't the law. It's the silence in those halls where decisions are made about who deserves to stay. 3 months passed since the judge's ruling allowed Juanito to stay legally, 90 days in which his life took a definitive turn. 90 days in which he stopped hiding but never stopped being cautious, because having papers isn't the same as being weightless. For a migrant, freedom always comes with conditions. Homeland Security's announced audit proceeded quietly, tension brimming. They combed every corner of his past, old job histories, school forms, medical visits, even his social media. They turned up nothing disqualifying him from the original decision. They found exactly what Juanito had always said, just a young man trying to survive, working from a very young age, never hiding out of cowardice, but out of necessity. The audit was closed with no charges, no apology either. With his legal status finally in place, Juanito resolved something he'd felt in his heart ever since that day he'd spoken in court. He didn't want his story to end with him. He couldn't let his words help only himself. Something inside him demanded more, not for ego or fame, but for purpose. He enrolled in a community program to get his GED, studying at night. By day, he continued volunteering at the organization that had once saved him, now assisting with document translations, filling out applications, escorting undocumented teens who arrived alone. That's how he met Kevin, a 16-year-old Honduran boy who spoke no English and barely ate. Juanito spotted him sitting hunched in a chair, waiting for his appointment. He sat down beside him, offered a bottle of water, and said quietly, "I've been there too, bro. I made it through." "You can too." Kevin didn't answer, but looked at him like someone glimpsing hope for the first time. Marisol resumed her cleaning jobs, though something had changed. Now, whenever she knocked on a door, walked into someone else's house to wash or scrub floors, she didn't feel invisible. She knew she was part of something bigger. She knew that her own story, fleeing across a desert to save her son, had reached more places than she'd ever imagined. Most importantly, she no longer lived in fear. She didn't sleep with one eye open, didn't dread ICE knocking at 2 a.m. "What's next?" a neighbor asked one day as they swept the sidewalk together. Marisol smiled without stopping the broom. "Now, living without hiding and helping others do the same." Later on, Mariana Solorzano published a book collecting real migrant stories of extreme struggles to stay in the U.S. The first chapter was dedicated to Juanito. The book's title was "We're Not Leaving Voices That Stay." At the book's launch in a Phoenix community library, Juanito stood in front of an audience. This time his hands weren't shaking. He no longer spoke as a victim, but as a survivor. "If I hadn't told my story, no one would have heard me. I'd have been deported, forgotten, end of story. But I spoke up, not out of bravery, but because I couldn't hold it in anymore. And I learned something many don't know. The system isn't built to hear us, but when it does, even by accident, it can't forget us so easily." People applauded. In the back, Marisol cried quietly, as always. But now, those tears weren't of anguish. They were of pride. Today, Juanito is working toward becoming a social worker. He's got about 2 years to go and sees no need to rush. In the afternoons, he still volunteers at the same non-profit that rescued him. Sometimes he speaks at schools. Other times, he helps unaccompanied minors at their initial hearings. When asked about his plans for the future, he always says, "I want to make sure no one's voice is ever silenced, like mine nearly was." His story didn't end perfectly. He's not wealthy. He still works hard. He hasn't forgotten fear. But he found something more valuable than peace of mind. A place in the world and a cause that keeps him standing. In a country where countless stories get lost in files, stamps, and borders, Juanito survived, and that alone meant he had already won. If you enjoyed this story, you're sure to love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and activate notifications. Until next time.